Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 20 of Series 10. The question for today is personal identity more dependent on facts, consciousness or values? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 4. So my underlying question is again, what can we do with our lives or human existence as consciousness? I claim that certain problems of human consciousness can be resolved through particular modes of value. These are evaluative problems, including, but not limited to, morals, meaning and purpose. And the particular modes of value are a will to value, leading to a sufficiency of value. Yet central and presuppositional to these claims about value is an appreciation of subjectivity as consciousness. And central to an appreciation of subjectivity as consciousness is the experience of personal identity. This is because personal identity is a first-person apprehension of consciousness from the inside, and such a first-person apprehension of our privileged ways of understanding consciousness. Yet before discussing my theories, I want to present the experience of personal identity as one of awe and mystery. This is because the experience of awe and mystery is often at the root of our bigger questions about life. It is at the root of the question, what is this thing that we call consciousness and what can we do with it? In the form of personal identity, we might ask, why am I myself and not someone else? Or why am I at this epoch of time or place rather than another? These questions indicate an awareness of personal identity, and I hope to answer them after looking at more orthodox theories. Among these are mundane answers like name, place, birth and profession, or even a soul or an essence. Others include my body, being an animal, rationality, memory, other people, and identifying as something. Others are recognizing myself as a conscious being or a value-creating being. These are some of the issues of personal identity that we should discuss today. Two groundbreaking books on the subject are Derek Parfit's psychological account in Reasons and Persons, and Barry Dainton's later The Phenomenal Self, that challenges such psychological accounts. Yet to begin, the question of personal identity raises a distinction between psychological and philosophical accounts. In psychology, the question, who am I, resonates from ancient Greece to Freud as know yourself. This task might involve observing oneself, recognizing aspects of oneself in one's unconscious, as well as honestly, insight and or through psychoanalysis. And paradoxically, a behaviorist approach may be of benefit here. That is, observing one's behavior may be more impartial than making intuitive judgments about oneself. The limits of that intuition or wishful thinking might be tested by some modern forms of self-identification. Can I identify, for example, as a Christian, as another gender, or as a goat with equal justification? The philosophical approach is different and is more discerning about key features of personal identity. But the existentialist approach is about creating oneself with choices rather than discovering oneself. Yet there's an overlap between psychological, existentialist and philosophical approaches. This is because we can choose to affirm psychological and philosophical views of ourselves. But before discussing either the psychological or the philosophical approach to personal identity, we need to examine how to identify physical objects or any kind of objects. Various methods have been employed that might or might not be applied to personal identity. Yet we should start with Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles. That is, if two things share all the same properties, then they are identical, or that there cannot be two distinct objects that have the same properties or are perfectly alike. Or in the case of one object, every entity has particular and specific properties. Or more simply, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's a duck. But what would determine the different identities of two atomically or anatomically identical objects? Would it be their location in space and time, or is it a function of the observing consciousness? Would it then just be their linguistic designation? Or is identity determined by continuity of existence? Or is it a matter of constituents? We can see then that the question of physical identity is tantalizing with many enigmas and paradoxes. An illustration of these enigmas is Neurath's boat, said to be rebuilt at sea one plank at a time. The question here is, did it return to land the same boat? In another version, the boat is rebuilt on land and all the old parts are put back together to make another boat, which then is the original boat. We might solve the problem by stipulating what we mean by original. But then we have the problem of a stipulated or an arbitrary identity. Plato evaded such issues by determining identity through his theory of universal forms and essences. That is, everything has an essence and a perfect counterpart or model in another metaphysical realm. For example, the existence of dogs are sustained by a perfect counterpart of dogness in another world. But the idea of a two-world metaphysical dualism has been rejected by modern thought. Yet Aristotle determined identities with the idea of purposes, as well as with fixed essences. But again, today we don't believe in essences or define things with objective purposes. We do use purposes to define things like a hammer, but we know that we have attributed these purposes. And science defines things with overt characteristics like size, mass, volume and weight. But for Aristotle, purpose is inherent to the identity of an object. For example, the purpose or character of a stone is to sink deeper into the ground. And Christianity took on Aristotelian metaphysics and essences to explain things like transubstantiation. Yet we might want to retain the idea of essence in the form of self-consciousness in the case of personal identity. But as we'll see, this view is challenged by non-Cartesian theories of consciousness. Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning poses another problem in rejecting single defining criteria. He gave the example of games having no single defining criterion. A more topical example is race. He regarded language as a form of life with complex and overlapping and entangled meanings. This is a linguistic argument against anything having a fixed essence, including consciousness. But we might consider consciousness as a special case, as we do shortly. These problems become more complicated when trying to define personal identity, which also has self-identity. Standard features of name, gender, age, ethnicity, culture, and personal history seem inadequate here. But we can start with John Locke's intuitively appealing criteria of consciousness and memory. In the archaic and convoluted language of the 17th century, Locke writes that with which consciousness of this present thinking thing can join itself makes the same person. And he held personal identity is maintained by psychological continuity through memory. The concept of personal identity can also be elucidated by comparison and contrast to the related idea of the self. That is, personal identity might be ephemeral and is different to the self, which implies continuity. We'll discuss the idea of the self in greater detail next week. Yet in the 18th century, David Hume famously said, "When I search for myself, I never can find myself as a self." But Hume seems to think of himself as another object in his field of perception, whereas he is the originator of his field of perception, like an eye that cannot see itself. This indicates that Hume's denial was a rather anachronistic conception of the self. Yet Derek Parfit drew on Locke and particularly Hume to construct his constitutive notion of personal identity. That is, as there is no adequate criterion of personal identity, people do not exist apart from their components. And what matters is psychological connectedness, namely of memory, character, and continuity. But this continuity isn't the personal identity that might survive transitions like death. Parfit argued that no unique identity, such as a self, unifies a person's experiences. Therefore, in questions about survival, personal identity is not an issue. To explain, Parfit used an illustration of a brain-damaged patient who becomes irreversibly unconscious. The patient is still alive, even though the fact is separate from the fact that his heart is still beating. But the fact that the patient is alive is not an independent or separately obtaining fact. The patient's being alive simply consists in the other facts. And in Parfit's view, these are what constitute the patient's identity. But to me, this seems more like the identity of a physical object. Parfit also used examples from science fiction, such as the teleporter, to explore ideas about unity. But Dainton also uses the same fictional thought experiments to come to opposing conclusions. And I might add that I have also found Parfit's views on self and value lacking, argued elsewhere. Yet Dainton does this by contrasting the phenomenal self with the psychological self. Dainton also explains his notion of a phenomenal self with the fictional idea of teleportation. People are reconstituted as data and reconstructed exactly as before, down to every neuron and memory. They believe themselves to be the same person as before, that is, their psychological self. They think they are the same person because they have the memories of the previous person. But Dainton and others suspect that teleportation would be a form of suicide. This is because the phenomenal self would not have the same phenomenal identity as the previous person. We can refer here to the above examples of mistaken identities in science fiction, film, and other stories. Some of these show people who thought they were reincarnations but found that they weren't. Dainton's notion of the phenomenal self makes two interesting points. One seems to show a widespread neglect of the phenomenal self as an aspect of consciousness, and this neglect is crucial to overlooking certain aspects of personal identity. And secondly, the phenomenal self says something vital about the nature of personal identity. Next week, I'll say something about Saul Kripke's acclaimed argument against physicalism based on the unique and a priori nature of personal identity as an aspect of consciousness. And I've also argued to reveal the neglect of consciousness in history, in philosophy, in the theory of physicalism, in the identity of clones, in discussions of AI and other contexts. Dainton's work also underlines the often overlooked, strange, uncanny, and mysterious nature of personal identity. As noted, personal identity evokes questions like, why am I here and not there, or now and not then? This is because, in my view, my identity is the phenomenon that I am. I am the centre of my circumstances, constituted by time, space and my body. I am only here, and I could only ever be here. If I were somewhere else, I would be someone else. Yet personal identity as consciousness is challenged by the idea of fission or radically divided consciousness. Evidence comes from split brains, fragmented personalities, and other considerations like schizophrenia. This idea of fission or radically divided consciousness is explained in another fictional Star Trek story. The first mate of the Starship Enterprise, Will Riker, is teleported to the surface of a planet. But something goes wrong, and in my version, Riker is left in place, but his atoms and molecules are duplicated. Sometime later, the new Riker meets the old Riker, but we can't tell who is original and who is replicated. They both seem to have unimpeachable physical claims to the memories, history and identity of the former Riker. This poses problems for personal identity as body, memory or personal uniqueness. This is because the new Riker thinks he is the old Riker, but he can't be, because he can't claim the same phenomenal identity as the old Riker. He can't claim the same phenomenal identity as the old Riker any more than anyone else is. This shows there is a phenomenal identity that is different in the new Riker and the old Riker. This is part of the philosophical mystery that is raised by the question of personal identity. But there's another earlier noted mystery of the experience of personal identity. And I've previously explained this experience with the concept of attenuated reference. Now, standard apprehension or perception involves contrast and reference to a background of understanding, that is, like a black spot on a white board that can't be perceived if it was a white spot. It is the contrast that makes the perception possible. Non-standard perception, such as in the cases above, use attenuated apprehension or attenuated cognition. This is a case of minimal contrasts in limited contexts or backgrounds of understanding. Examples of such are apprehending the universe, being, God, or flying saucers. These are in some degree inherently mysterious objects. Yet personal identity as self-consciousness is also an instance of attenuated reference. This is because self-consciousness cannot compare itself to other minds in the same way that it apprehends itself. And personal identity is experienced in a way, but it does not experience objects or other people. And this is thereby experienced as a form of mystery or mysteriousness. Yet even if the phenomenal self is a central way of defining personal identity, we cannot ignore its other aspects. And Parfit's constitutive notion of personal identity, which seems to overlook the phenomenal self, as well as other aspects that we have noted, behoves us to examine these other aspects. So we should examine various other ways and means of defining and determining personal identity, such as psychological features like memory, the body, a phenomenal self, other people, and value. So we'll now look at these locations as the body, the memory, the phenomenal self, and value. First, look at the earlier noted idea in psychology and philosophy that identity is constituted by memory. Films like Blade Runner, Instant Recall, and Star Trek employ the idea of memories determining identity. Also, total memory loss through accident or disease is often associated with the loss of identity. One of the most celebrated cases of memory loss is that of Clive Waring in 1985. He was unable to recall past memories, and his memory span was sometimes limited to a few seconds. So he consequently experienced greeting his wife as if it was the first time, every time. Such events seem to link personal identity to memory. Cases of disrupted memories and disassociations of time also raise issues of ethics as well as identity. We can then ask, to what degree should an old person be held responsible for his actions as a teenager? Can a total amnesiac be held responsible for actions of which he has no inkling? That is, if identity depends on memory, can he be held responsible for past actions? These questions indicate a deeper foundation of personal identity than memory. Yet our memory connects us to many of our experiences, such as our sense of place. And sense of place, as a constituent of our identity, is expressed in Heidegger's notion of being in the world. His exploration of the idea of dwelling, for example, isn't just inhabiting a space, but meaningfully engaging with it. That is, Dasein is always situated within a specific situation that is both spatial and temporal across time. And the spaces we inhabit thereby shape how we understand the world and who we are. Merleau-Ponty extended Heidegger's being in the world to needing a body to be in the world. He held that much knowledge is acquired and articulated through the body. Motor skills are forms of knowledge that are structured around the body, for example in sport and speaking. And knowledge of the body provides an immediate access to who we are. Yet the idea of personal identity, as determined by the body, has different levels of refinement. Most basic is the physicalist "I am my body," without reference to personal history or self-consciousness. This seems to be the means of self-identification of animals or extremely unreflective people. Yet, as argued here, self-identification isn't an absolute, but involves numerous aspects. One of these is acquiring self-knowledge through the body in sport. An example of this, the British used to say, the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton, to show the knowledge learnt in sports. A modern example would be motor skills learnt in driving motor vehicles. We are talking here about personal identity as knowledge expressed through the body. As another example, Max Wellmann's related consciousness, or at least self-awareness, to various locations in the body. He locates some experiences of bodily sensations on the surface or internal to the body, and that inner experiences such as verbal thoughts and images seem to be in the head. And a lot of metaphors, ancient and modern, also point to consciousness being identified with parts of the body. Body metaphors including having guts, cold feet, lily-livered, stiff-necked, having heart, and breath of life. The stomach is sometimes referred to as a second mind due to its large number of nerve endings. The point is that identifying oneself with a body isn't as crude as it might first seem. The question, who am I, also finds considerable resonance in the presence of other people, individually or socially. We noted earlier that perception or understanding requires a comparison or contrast with something else. And this is also a need, or perhaps a greater need, in the case of people. It is sometimes joked that the family dog living with people thinks it's a person. In the case of a human being, we might look to theories of self, consciousness, and personal identity. But these are vacuous, without immediate living examples of what a human being is. To know something, we need an idea of what it is derived from an example. This view is expressed in different theories at different levels. At the most basic level, it has been thought that other people are even needed to evoke self-consciousness. I don't agree, because I think that consciousness has a greater biological than social foundation. But it seems plausible that other people are needed to evoke higher levels of awareness. A child trying to grow up, for example, must look to adults to know what it is to be an adult. Later, people look to models like saints, heroes, pop stars, and influencers to shape their values and ideas. And in social groups, objectification and internalization reinforce such values and ideas. Paul Ricoeur finds further dimensions of personal identity to add to those of body, memory, and consciousness. Like Parfit and above, he poses both a collective identity with other people and a narrative identity over time. But he also poses both an identity that never changes and an identity that remains the same. And he adds that this sameness of identity responds better to the question who rather than what, which has particular implications. That is, the question what I am gives way to who I am, and this question is answerable in terms of value. For Ricoeur, these are internalized values discovered in social, political, and ethical relations. So he answers the question of personal identity in terms of values, concerns, and aspirations. But why does Ricoeur locate personal identity in value rather than in consciousness or the phenomenal self? We might say that consciousness alone is neutral or an abstract concept without material content, and consciousness as cognition or a fact may be insufficiently substantive. Yet expressions of value like morals, meaning and purpose are central to personal identity. So as Ricoeur holds, personal identity may have to be determined by value. The idea of being ultimately identified by one's values is attractive and has affinity with my own idea of value. But the idea of phenomenal consciousness competes with personal values as criteria of identity. Yet, as I have previously argued, there's a way of synthesizing consciousness and value. That is, in the view that consciousness and value are intimately related or mutually coexistent. In fact, phenomenologists identify consciousness as value and regard value as a constituent of consciousness. Heidegger, for example, cites care as the being of Dasein, and Sartre writes that the being of the self is value. And he goes on to say that reflective consciousness cannot arise without at the same time disclosing values. Sartre explains that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, and every choice supposes elimination and selection, thereby producing value. That is, elimination and selection presuppose disfavour and preference that are negative and positive expressions of value. The existentialist emphasis on freedom and choice provides further clarification of this identification. Freedom is a precondition of at least moral values as well as of the possibility of choosing to be oneself. Sartre, for example, writes that to choose is to affirm the value of that which is chosen. And together, these properties of consciousness provide a basis of personal identity. These identifications of personal identity with value by Ricoeur, Heidegger and Sartre may appear theoretical. Yet a more visceral expression of value as personal identity can be found in religion. To explain this, we can note Feuerbach's projection theory of religion, in which God expresses two things. One, mankind's highest value, and two, man himself projected outside of himself in the form of a divine being. For the believer, then, human identity is thereby bound up with divine identity as value. And religion is indisputably a febrile expression of values, feelings, and human identity. That is, religion is a potent system of meaning that many people have lived by and have died for. The associations of personal identity with feelings and values is also found in New Testament texts such as, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," Matthew 6:21. So in conclusion, we have found a multiplicity of factors that can contribute to personal identity. These included memory, the body, a sense of place, other people, value, and even religion. And there was some controversy over the idea of consciousness as an integrative concept, as well as whether a phenomenal self was fundamental to this idea. Yet I noted that personal identity is a crucial first-person view of consciousness from the inside. This enabled me to answer the question of personal identity in terms of consciousness and value. Because one, consciousness is central to human existence as personal identity, and two, value is an essential aspect of both consciousness and personal identity. Consciousness, value, and the phenomenal self were thereby presented as central to personal identity. Yet the many aspects that contribute to personal identity were underlined by the complexities that also contribute to determining personal identity. These included Leibniz's principle of indiscernibles, the paradox of Neurath's boat, problems of essences and purposes, and Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning. And can physical objects be identified by their location in space and time, by linguistic designation, by their constituents, or by their continuity of existence? And the idea of personal identity may add a further complexity to these many considerations, which might be seen to provide a simplification in that personal identity is given a form of self-identity, that is, again, in the capacities of consciousness, a phenomenal self, and value. So let me have your criticism and comments on websites like meetup.com, Philosophy of Value workshops. I'm looking for your reasons, either for approbation or where you think I am mistaken.